So, willkommen zu einer weiteren Vorlesung zum digitalen Humanismus. Welcome, everybody. This is our last lecture before Christmas, just FYI, but I'll say it again at the end. Today we have again two very exciting presentations. We're going to start with Sebastian Cicek and Eugenia Stambolev, who are going to talk about living in a world full of AI. But I'm going to let you explain what this is all about, and then we'll have time for questions, and then we get to our second presenter afterwards.
All right, so thanks for having us. So the talk is about living in a world full of AI, but the focus is on comprehending, understanding, and partaking, and whatever that means in a world of AI. Let me start by motivating why we talk about this topic. As you've heard on the news, realized yourself, the capabilities of AI are increasing, and for now, let's just work without a formal definition of what AI is. Let's just go with the vague feeling of everything is AI and everything needs AI and everything is getting better if there's AI in it. But maybe just looking back what it means to have AI systems and how they are becoming better and better in certain tasks. So if you look 20 years back, people were happy if they were able to build an AI system that was able to identify, for instance, handwritten digits in order to faster process post envelopes. This has changed. We now use AI tools, right, to support us in our text creation by checking our grammar, making improvements how to write better texts. We can use AI to have self-driving cars, but I think a common usage, maybe all of us are doing, is use AI for content generation, right? So for instance, we use ChatGPT to generate text, some use it to brainstorm, some use it to solve homeworks, which they shouldn't, others use it to generate images and so on. So there's really kind of a vast amount of applications. I think what's different to other technological advances is that this time, this is challenging parts of human superiority, I would argue. So at least in specialized areas, AI is really kind of competing or going beyond what humans can do. For instance, in cognitive tasks, you've heard it in the news regarding gameplay. AI is often able to beat human champions in that regard. It's also creeping into an area which I think was considered reserved for human intelligence, which is creativity. I'm not getting into philosophical discussions what creativity is, but we can use AI to generate text, to generate images and videos and all these kinds of things of, I would say, good quality and at least competitive with not so advanced artists. And then AI is also becoming competitive or partly superiority in physical tasks. If you pair these things with robotics, for instance, a robot doesn't get tired. It can go on as long as you provide energy. Now, through these capabilities, AI is used in more and more areas, and things have changed, are changing, and will change. So this is partly already disruptive, and it will most likely be more disruptive for economy and workforce, right? So jobs will change, have changed, certain tasks can be automated. AI is changing communication and social interaction. Whenever you go to a social network, you live on all the recommendations that happen in the background without you actually seeing this, often also without you being able to interact. There are also online social companions which you can have, so you don't need any real friends anymore. You can do everything with AI. Of course, this is not meant that serious, but you get the point, right? Another area where AI is really making a difference is in education. We can have personalized AI assistants globally accessible and all the time. What I think now important is that this has obviously political implications. Countries are competing in being at the forefront of this kind of AI area, of having AI technology, and maybe more connected to what we are going to talk about. Obviously, politics and all of us, we need to understand what the application and the usage of AI systems means, when and how we want to use them, what are the ethical implications of using them, what are societal impacts, and in many cases, I guess it's coming down to making trade-offs between certain aspects like innovation and, for instance, the societal aspects I have mentioned. So, as I said, I would argue that people should have a say in how AI is used because it has far-reaching consequences for it all. But the question is how. So what is needed for people, and by people I now mean kind of everyone, like with different backgrounds, different levels of education. What is needed for them to understand what an AI system is doing? How can they form an opinion about an AI system? How can they understand an AI system, whatever that means in the first place? And how can we enable discussions about AI systems with the goal of eventually deciding whether we want to use them, for instance, in certain applications? And I want to make the point that the requirement to understand is at least partly connected to the requirement to explain these systems. I think Jenny will take a partly different viewpoint later on, but we will have a good in-project discussion live on stage on that topic. But for my part, at least, let's roughly equate kind of the need to understand with the need to explain these AI systems. So our program for this talk is to have a brief introduction about the project, which is kind of funding the research, then give a brief background on AI and explainable AI, then what research and studies we did in the context of fostering understanding, and then I will hand over to Jenny, who will talk more about the limits of what I'm advocating right now, the limits of explainable AI, and how kind of our perspective on considerations in that regard should probably shift to move forward, and then we are already at the end. So the research I'm talking about is funded by WWTF project, so thanks. The project is Interpretability and Explainability as Drivers to Democracy. It's really hinging on the observation or idea that it's important for us, for all of us, to decide upon the usage of AI systems, and very often also about their deployment, and that we want to understand how people can understand AI systems, as said, what this means in the first place, and what this means for developing methods that support people in getting understanding of AI systems, getting a sufficient understanding such, for instance, they can decide whether they want to have such a system or not. That's a topic not only living in computer science, so I'm a computer scientist, but it's a very interdisciplinary kind of topic. So we joined together with philosophers. So Jenny will then continue. She's part of the team. So we have a team of 6 people. The hard work is done by Tim Schmude and Jenny, and there's a bunch of other people who sometimes give their opinions on topics and also do some research, obviously. The motivation we initially gave when kind of proposing that project was inspired by 2 contexts going on in Austria. So some of you might have heard about the Arbeitsmarktservice algorithm. So that's an algorithm which was developed by the developed for the Arbeitsmarktservice. So they wanted to use this to support workers at the Arbeitsmarktservice in deciding who should get support when they are jobless in order to find a job as quickly as possible. And to this end, they developed a model, let's just call it AI, and we can discuss later whether this is AI or not. So they developed some model which makes a prediction about a person based on features like age, education, where they come from, and so on, and giving essentially a score of how likely it is that they find a job within a certain amount of time. And why did this come to the news? And just as a side remark, so this is currently not used, the system. It came to the public attention because people noticed that the system is doing things which some might not want, and probably most of us agree that we don't want this. So the system learned that, for instance, females, mothers, people with care duties, they have less chances on the job markets. So they explicitly kind of figured out that there is essentially a negative score if you satisfy any of these attributes. I guess the surprising thing, or this thing why this caught attention, is because it's really kind of black and white. You can just look at the model and it's just showing you that this is the case. It's probably also the case without the model, but then at least you don't see it that directly. So this is an application of an AI-like system happening around us, and I guess it makes sense for us to understand what's going on, and it makes sense to try to enable all of us to say we want to have such a system or we don't want to have such a system. Another example that was kind of recent at the time when we proposed the project was that of predicting the spread of COVID, right? So like many decisions were based on predictions about how COVID spreads in the population of Austria, for instance. Behind the scenes, there were kind of models used, not all of them probably AI models, but complicated models were used that made forecasts about COVID will spread. And based on this, some decisions were made. And I think there was a discussion going on about whether people understood what these models are predicting and what conclusions we really can draw from these predictions, what predictions can we make in the first place given the data and so on. So in this case, it would be particularly important, for instance, for politicians to understand what these models are doing. And what we see here in these two examples, so there are different groups of people that might be interested in understanding systems, the general public, politicians. If one thinks further, one can identify even more groups of stakeholders or people that need to know something about AI systems. We conceptualized the whole thing along the life or usage cycle of an AI system and came up, for instance, with this figure. So this is not representative for all AI systems, but for some. So very often you first build an AI system. You then use this AI system to provide decision support, for instance, score an employability score for a person. Then you use it to make an actual decision about whether you apply, for instance, support measures to find a job. You communicate this decision. This can be in a one-on-one communication or can be via the news, as in the Corona case. And then later on, I mean, that's not always happening, but I think that's something which should be there. There should be someone who kind of looks at these decisions and says whether this is a good thing or not and whether we want to go on with that. And in many places of this usage, there is the need to understand what the model is doing. And in many cases, the decisions and the perceptions of kind of relevant stakeholders that are affected by the decisions of such a system should feed back in how such a system is used. We were asked to kind of relate our projects and what we are doing to digital humanism. So let me just give you one slide on why this is the real digital humanism project you want to follow. So it's all about kind of human-centric technology. So we want to ensure that AI systems or complicated prediction models serve humans, that they are designed in a way that prioritizes the well-being and avoids harm. And this is essentially kind of ensured by enabling people to have a look and say this is kind of doing the right thing or not. These things are also needed to satisfy ethical responsibility, right? So for instance, fairness. I brought up this example about the Arbeitsmarktservice algorithm, and without looking in such a system, the system would maybe just have been used without anyone saying this is probably not a model in the way we want to use it. It's kind of unfair to half of the population of Austria. The other thing is inclusivity. So the project is really about enabling diverse groups of peoples to kind of understand AI systems and have a say about these AI systems. And this can be really very different stakeholders with different background knowledge and so on. And the last box we tick from the definition of digital humanism is that of interdisciplinary collaboration. So this is a project which cannot be done solely by computer science. So that's why we teamed up with folks from philosophy who bring in other perspectives and also kind of support us in questioning how we do things. And as we will hear from Jenny, what things we should explain or how we should even go beyond the things that we are considering. Let me move on to briefly give some background on artificial intelligence and later on explainable artificial intelligence. So most of the AI systems I've been talking about, not the Arbeitsmarktservice algorithm, but like the models you see around like ChatGPT and so on, they're based on deep learning. Some decades ago, people set the foundations for deep learning by figuring out that what's happening in the brain, namely that we have a large network of interconnected neurons, can also be done in some way on a computer by creating artificial neurons and connecting them through a bunch of weights. This is just sketched here. So every kind of circle essentially corresponds to a unit, and these units are connected by so-called weights. And these are numbers that one tunes when one trains a model, when one kind of makes sure that such a model actually works. For those interested, I'm not going to talk about this. Such a neural network implements a particular function, and this function is then used, for instance, to make predictions about what objects are present in an image. Deep learning is really the central building block of essentially, I guess, all the things you think about AI in gameplay, for instance, for AlphaGo, but also for systems like ChatGPT and so on. What's important here is that models that build on such technology, they are huge and they're non-trivial to understand. Just to give you an idea, so I said that we have networks of neurons with parameters connecting all of them. If we look at GPT-3, so that's a model that was used in ChatGPT, I guess 2 years ago or so, such a model comes with 175 billion of these parameters, and all these parameters are adjusted when such a model is trained. And how they are adjusted depends on very many things. It depends on what data you train such a model on. So you've probably read on the news, like ChatGPT is essentially trained on all the data you can get from everywhere, all books and so on. And then we have complicated ways of training them. Also here, I will not go into detail, but what you should take away is that we have huge complicated models with many parameters which we adjust based on data. And that's what really makes these models hard to understand. So we know how these models work on a technical level. We know what precise computations they do. That's why we can build them. But when we ask like more these intuitive questions, like how would you explain why you, I don't know, gave this response to a prompt, then on ChatGPT, then things become harder. Or why did you say this person has a high employability score or not? But this is important. We need these kinds of explanations. We need to make these predictions transparent in order to enable humans to challenge decisions, for instance, or to ensure that the model is safe doing the right things in certain applications, or also to make humans able to decide whether they want to use a model at all. And this is essentially motivating the need for explainable AI, where explainable AI is about ensuring that humans can keep intellectual oversight over a model. And intellectual oversight over a model certainly doesn't mean to understand the meaning of each of these 175 billion parameters, but it rather means to have like an overall abstract idea of how decisions come about. The area or the field of explainable AI directly tries to address such topics. And I'm just giving you one example of what's going on in the technical field of explainable AI. So a standard technique which is used here is called LIME. So that's local interpretable model agnostic explanations. I don't know, all of you are probably not in maths backgrounds, but you have to solve some optimization problem based on some new data you generate for some input you want to make a prediction for, right? You give a prompt to ChatGPT, then you would generate some new data, and then you would kind of fit a new model which you think is simpler than the original model and give this away as an explanation of what the model is doing. This is a complicated process. You don't need to understand everything. I just want to show an example of how that could like play out in practice. So here is where you apply an interpretability technique to explaining why like a model, an AI model detecting objects in an image is making the predictions it does. So the input is the image shown on the left. It's an image of bread in a bowl. And here you see which parts of the image in green support the prediction that this image is showing bagels. It's not showing bagels, but there are parts which apparently support this is a bagel. Even more interesting, you can also ask like why this model supports that you see strawberries here. So there are no strawberries there, but you can ask why there are strawberries. And you see parts of this image in red, so these don't support that you see a strawberry here, but you see green parts which suggest or support the prediction that there's strawberry. So this looks very awkward, right? So I agree this is very awkward. And what I want to emphasize with this is that we have a very complicated technique, which probably takes people without background a couple of hours or days to understand. And then you get explanations which are hard to understand. So that's probably not the way forward. So what shall we do, or what is the problem here? These techniques are not necessarily useful for all of us. And in particular, I would argue that they are not useful for lay people, for technical lay people that have not so much like technical background. So we set out to understand more what different stakeholders, in particular stakeholders with less background, need to understand such systems. And I want to use the last 5 minutes I have to talk about some results of some studies we conducted. So all of this was background so far, and now we come to the real stuff. So we went out and asked people what they want to understand about an AI system in order to decide whether they want to use it. And we designed for this a task-based interview study, which is inspired by this Arbeitsmarktservice application, so this employability prediction I was talking about before. And we had another use case where people were kind of looking at wristbands for elderly care, which were automatically calling for help if they detected that something was going on which shouldn't be going on. And we really focused on people without technical background and people that would work in jobs where kind of understanding the systems which have such gaps would be important. So we asked people, we asked AI novices what they would want to know in order to understand in the first place what are their information needs. So really focused on the people that are affected in some way by the decisions of such an AI system. And what's interesting here is that we get a catalog of questions people care about, which is different to what is typically done, at least in my field. So in the end, we came up with something which we termed an XAI novice question bank, so stressing that this is for technical novices, and to contrast it to other question banks which are around. There are question banks around where they interviewed AI experts, AI designers, asking them what they want to know, and we kind of did the step and asked more people from the street what they would want to know. And what's really interesting here is that the questions differ. Novices, AI novices or lay people care a lot about, for instance, why a system is used, who put a system in place, what was the intent behind such systems. And this is even more amplified, which makes a sense in settings where the application of such a system is considered as risky, as a high-risk system. Then you have also other questions like how can the system be operated? Are there ways to misuse such a system? Where, why, and how was data collected and used to train such systems? And one really sees differences between what experts want to know and what novices want to know. And this is an important building block of kind of designing better explanations for people that don't have probably the background of AI experts. Another study I want to talk briefly about is a setting where we were wondering whether people can also discuss AI systems in groups. So this was kind of taking the next step. We were wondering, let's say, we really would have a say, we did a kind of public vote on whether we want to use an AI system. And you get maybe in Switzerland, you get information about this AI system, you have to digest this and later on make a decision. And what would people probably do? They would take this information and they would kind of talk to other people they know, talk to friends and so on, and eventually come up with a decision of whether they want to have this system. So we did another task-based user study where we asked people to kind of discuss a system, to query an explanation of a system. So we designed a special explanation which was designed in a way such that participants in the study could get information at different technical levels, kind of starting from a base level. They could always say, I want to understand this deeper, I want to understand more, and so on. And the questions were organized in different categories. And by this, we wanted to figure out what kind of information they query and how they use it to foster their discussions. And what's for example, interesting in such a case is that we really see differences in how groups of people use information or what kind of information they use in contrast to if you ask individuals to understand the system, giving them the same form of explanations of an AI system. So for instance, you see this in the top row. So here you see what categories of information or explanations they found most helpful for understanding an AI system, and the colors indicate different categories: data, system details, usage, context, and so on. And for instance, what we see here, that in focus groups there was much more interest in kind of this bluish bar, which was about data aspects behind the system, than when we talk to individuals. Obviously, there can be multiple explanations for this. One explanation could be that in a group, it's more likely that you have a person, for instance, that is aware about privacy aspects in data, or understands a bit more or different aspects, or has different thoughts on how data is used in such AI systems. From the information we extracted from these studies, we came up with a bunch of suggestions of how one should design explanations for individuals, but also in particular for groups of explanations, going into 6 different directions. I do not really have time to go into this, but I think the important takeaway is that you want to, and we are not the first to find this, but I think we got to this conclusion from a different angle, that you want explanations to be adaptive and personalizable, that people can kind of consume this information in the order, in the way, and in a pace they want, and that you provide, for instance, different modalities. Not all of us are good in understanding the same type of information. Some consume easier text information, whereas others consume more easily information from images. All right, so I would have some more, but I'm skipping this to also give Jenny enough time to talk about what she has to say in that regard. I hope I gave you a quick glance of the type of kind of research we did here, and Jenny will give us some new opinions and insights and directions. Let me just turn off my mic.
Of the discussion. Oh, perfect. You switched it. Well, thank you so much. There was a very brief overview of what we actually did over 3 years, which is impossible to really summarize. And now you're going to get a bit of the meta perspective from the philosophers in the group, or particularly from my side, which means to, at least I framed it as a shift, as something I considered moving from explainability research to literacy research. But the first thing I have to say, and this is really important because it seems like as if I think that explainability research is wrong or something is limited. I really considered it from the beginning a crucial start, because the project started with this idea of knowing, wait a minute, we have AI, it's becoming bigger and more opaque in society, it's really a problem, and it's a democratic problem. And this is where we all agreed from the beginning. But of course, then we shifted into different debates in how to move on. And I'm not just a philosopher, I'm also a media scholar. So for me, debates also of media literacy were quite common. And for me, this idea of educating people about technology wasn't so new, but it was interesting to see how explainability develops from a computational point of view, and what could be missing if you put the lens on from a democratic point of view. So basically, if you ask, what would a democratic context need on AI, and not what could we explain as computational scientists. Both things merge, of course, at some point, and they're important. But just to keep that in mind when I talk about limits, I don't want to be misunderstood as I think this, it has no place. It also is very crucial for expert discussions, by the way. So to come back very briefly to this idea of digital humanism. So there were 2 points or 2 core elements about, and we picked them up like philosophically, put more emphasis on this, the idea of ethical responsibility and of inclusivity. So this, of course, means to ask in a wider sense, what would it take for someone to be really empowered and to be included by understanding AI? So not just the idea of what is an explanation, and how can we explain, but to move forward. And we worked with case studies, and at the beginning, as Sebastian very well said, it was about the IMS study and the algorithm, and we decided to look into that into more detail. And I think that from the technical side, that's what they really did. And I, in parallel, also looked into other case studies, and one of them was the childcare benefit scandal in the Netherlands. That's something some might have heard. People who work with discrimination and so on, they usually have heard of it because it was really a big thing. The whole government stepped down, so it was really a thing. But besides that, many people were affected by it. Very briefly, because it's a long story, there was the Dutch government experimented, I would say, with people and with society and implemented a risk system, which wasn't really even AI. But then in the discussion, it kind of became AI. But it doesn't matter because I know that even in the team, we sometimes discussed, even we can talk about algorithms can do as much harm. We don't have to even talk about AI. It discriminated people on the wrong connection it made to the data and to the models, which would have been avoided. I don't know why it wasn't. But for instance, it treated non-Dutch nationals unfairly and accused them of tax fraud more often. And now I dived more and more into this case. And what I was really fascinated by, for once, many debates answered with, okay, this is a perfect case study for explainability. Like, this case would have needed so much more explainability. Because it's true. There was lots of bias in the model, discrimination. No one really understood what the other people are doing. So there was the classic, also too many stakeholders are involved. Even a question we debated in the project, because we realized, okay, explainability is actually very hard to do just for one stakeholder group. You have to really figure out who's involved, who's deciding, who isn't, what's a lay person, and all these kind of things. And then one thing that really stand out for me was the realization that from the point of view of those affected by the algorithm, even explainability wouldn't have given them anything because it wouldn't have been given to them. No one would have explained to those negatively affected. There's a bit of a paradox, by the way, because how do you explain to someone potentially discriminated, you're going to be potentially discriminated, but live with it. So there is a certain paradox in the discussion when we say education and literacy, because we don't really think it through till the end. So far, AI is discriminatory for many groups in society, and there's no way you can explain that with a smile and say, there we go, that's just how it is. So how we're dealing with this is actually another tricky thing, but I hope that literacy understandings can actually shift a little bit more. Well, so that's why the problems that XAI couldn't fix in this case was more interesting for me. And the main one was those affected by it cannot be empowered in a proper way. And of course, I also think that in addition to it, and we see it now, the regulation of AI, the bureaucratic chaos and the bureaucratic opacity will become a huge problem. And I'm not sure we can deal with explanatory models here, but it will be really tricky. And I think lots of knowledge will be lost there, which is an old problem and not an AI problem. And we might blame AI, but actually could have been a bureaucratic gap somewhere. So this also became very clear that here too, for instance, in the Dutch case, it was definitely a human error. So it wasn't really AI. Like it could have been clear much earlier that the nationalities shouldn't have been considered important features for tax fraud. I mean, it's illegal, but they did it. So yeah, but that wasn't AI. AI was just doing its job, or the algorithm was just doing what it's supposed to do. Okay, now thinking about empowerment, and now democratically speaking, what does it mean? So there was a distinction I noticed early on then in the debate. When we talk about explainability, we often focus on transparency, and it's important. It's kind of a no-brainer. But transparency from a political and media perspective is a bit of an ideological term. It's never neutral. Transparency is always used still as a way to not show everything, because you cannot show everything. It's impossible. You cannot, and even you mentioned it previous, there's also no point in just showing every feature of a system or just explaining everything. It would be an overload. But transparency often doesn't show specific things. As I told you before, how would you explain discriminatory behavior of an algorithm? This would never be taught. This would never be made transparent because you don't want to scare off people. So there's certain ways of changing the perspective from transparency and from technical transparency to the idea that democratically speaking, you need to maybe shift not so much between lays and experts, but more between vulnerable people and deciders. So this was then my idea, to really shift even the focus in how we understand stakeholders. Because someone who's negatively affected by AI is not just a not expert, they're also a vulnerable citizen. And this is another level of a democratic, and usually these vulnerable citizens are already vulnerable before AI. So they're not, for them, this is not new. AI is just a new, basically, well, kid in town, doing this discrimination, because before they usually are already in systems that are discriminating them. So out of this idea to play with the kind of stakeholder debate and to change it a little bit, there was another attached research to this, which was about realizing, well, explaining is in itself a quite problematic term. If some of you do more like science and technology studies or science communication, explaining is being discussed a lot there as an authority, actually, as something that is very top-down. And I don't know if some of you, I mean, explaining is also very often used in educational studies, like in parents-children studies. So it's always like you explain to someone who is basically, it's top-down. It's never on eye level. Explaining is never done as a democratic process in itself. Of course, in this case, it's an expert debate where you have to explain to lays. But even here, democratically speaking, there is an authority element that bothered us, at least from a philosophical perspective. And then explaining is also not enough. I think it's crucial to do it, but it's not enough. As I said with the case study before, there's always a limit to when you explain and there's no way to act upon the explanation, it stops. It's a dead end. Because what happens to people if you explain to them and then they're going to take the knowledge and do what? What should they do? So what if they're not happy with it? Or how could they just say, no, I don't want this? So there's a certain limit to where to go from here. And democratically speaking, of course, this is, again, in a context of an ethical debate and democratic debate and a debate of inclusivity. So how can we make people more inclusive in this context? And we realized the AI and explainability discussion is actually a much bigger one. It's attached to many more contexts and societal problems, and specifically taken from the perspective of vulnerable people. It's very, very hard to just work with things like explainability. So to sum those things up, we then, where there are a few things like opacity is an issue. Of course, in every context, opacity is an issue, but transparency in a technical sense is never enough because it's limited. Most of the time, I know it's shifting, by the way, so the explainability debate is one of those really dynamic ones, so there's lots of self-critique in the explainability debate itself. The idea of expert stakeholders is very often present, but it wouldn't affect people who are vulnerable, so they wouldn't profit from these debates at all, and democratically as well. And the direction of information is a problematic one in the term of explaining, which again is top-down and one way, and it ends. Because once you explain, the other person has to basically just agree with you. But what happens if they disagree? There's no way to loop back. Now, what to do? There were two things. I, of course, looked into AI literacy debates. And surprisingly, AI literacy, maybe now the last months, but over the last 3 years, it wasn't really used so much as a term. It's not, explainability is like still the main term. And if it's used, it's usually just about skills. It's about really technical things with AI. It's not a literacy in itself outside of AI context. And the second thing, I realized there's lots of things to learn from media literacy studies. I have to say, though, that it's a quite critical, so it's in the media studies, media literacy is a very critical term because it's used as a way to educate, and of course you have to know, but media literacy studies very quickly realized, and it's doing this now for, I don't know, 60, 70 years, of course, how to educate people, how to work with media, and he quickly realized we cannot just tell people how the media works. We have to include the political and social aspect, and then it becomes always tricky. Always tricky, because then you have to start teaching politics in school, for instance, and this tricky. I mean, we sometimes say it's very, very important, but how do you do it? So here's a certain dilemma. We also still not sure how to resolve, and that's why very often when people say literacy, they speak about technical skills only, which is not enough, in my view at least. But now summing everything up, and unfortunately I have to, there's still lots of elements that these debates between explainability and media literacy were very, very important and very crucial, at least in my work, to even understand how do we move from this idea that first of all, explaining to whom. How do we define stakeholder? Are we defining them as tech experts and non-tech experts, or do we define them as citizens, as vulnerable citizens or as non-vulnerable citizens? And one thing that was crucial in this is to consider also how to get them on board. And I can tell you already now that, at least from the context of media studies and digital culture studies and so on and so forth, or digital humanism, there are quite a few projects at the moment out there beginning to think about participatory models of AI, which kind of include the explainability discussion within the kind of discussion. Because it becomes, if you develop AI with a certain group together, then of course you're constantly explaining and they're feedbacking. So it's a bit of an empowered structure already, and then you don't need to explain it afterwards. Another thing I find absolutely key is to make this debate interdisciplinary. So I guess that's why explainability is not so much wrong, it's just a disciplinary discussion, obviously. And the more interdisciplinary it becomes, of course, the messier it becomes. But we think that's absolutely key. And not just interdisciplinary with universities, but also with NGOs, other research institutions, and journalists. Because at least for my work, journalism and press and media are very, very crucial info points, also on AI developments. And even so, this case with the childcare benefit fraud was detected by journalists. So they basically then found it, as a problem, because the people who complained, no one listened to them. So sometimes you need also, those vulnerable people need voices, and they need to be seen and asked what is happening. And now the downer to all of this. It's amazing as it sounds. We also know by now, at least there we can learn a lot, at least from public science debates, because they're being absolutely pioneering this idea of how to do science with citizens. There's a certain fatigue that comes in. You cannot now start asking people, and especially vulnerable groups, which you cannot just address anyway. You cannot just go to a group and say, hey, you're, discriminated, so now work with me on AI. It's just, there's so many ethical problems here. And there's a certain fatigue. That's always a problem. And one thing this debate should not introduce is then to say, well, and suddenly everyone who's a layperson should be deciding everything over AI. So it should also not be completely outsourced into lays that are, again, also not really expert in the field. So there should be a certain expertise still standing, because otherwise we drift into the other problem, which we see now with the media discourse, where everyone's not believing in expertise anymore because suddenly people think their opinions are enough. So there are many conflicts to maneuver with and to shift around, but I think at least that the focus on developing a democratically constituted literacy model that is broader than just a technical, and I think we all agreed actually on that, could be a very good continuation of the explainability debate, which I think still was absolutely crucial because it came on very early on in the AI discussion, and it's kind of rare, to be honest, to have technologies developing in parallel with the discussions on how to critique them or how to explain them. So I think that was definitely key to have this, and I think there will be continuously those discussions, but it might split actually into an expert one and maybe one on the literacy, but this is actually a bit open for now. So conclusion, and I'm supposed to very briefly wrap up. Well, AI is important. No one really understands it, and that's also sometimes an excuse, by the way, because actually many people do understand exactly what's happening, and we should be careful in not to integrate or blur too many also human mistakes that are happening around AI and blame them into the technical. That's also one of the dangers, by the way, that happens with the whole chaos around it. It's key that we find ways to inform people, but also include them in decisions about AI. And it doesn't have to be even just AI. It can be algorithmic systems in general. I think sometimes we're overblowing this idea of AI as this, and from my position now, and this is maybe my conclusion, and I was left to do it, so I will say it. It's not about critical prompting. Telling people how to prompt will not be an educational measure to really educate citizens, because you're already teaching them to use a company product. And this is not empowerment, this is making them users. So I'm very, very critical with how we are developing the debate also in the university context, in what really critical or inclusive literacy models could mean. And looking forward is the last point. I'm not sure if there was supposed to be a looking forward. I'm supposed to end on a... okay, exactly. Looking forward would be maybe, to just continue the discussions, and we open up for questions now.
Yes, thank you so much for your presentation. Yeah, we're a bit out of time, but we have a little bit of time for questions before we go to our next speaker. And then, of course, at the end, there's also questions. Question time. So who has a question for Eugenia and Sebastian? Yeah, no questions. No? Yeah, Thorsten? And we have also a student asking. We go to him first. I mean, of course, we have lots of questions, right? Yes.
Can you explain again the sentence or the header on one of the slides about the not AI only, as explaining AI? I can't remember. It's like 5, 6 slides ago. AI is not empowering, only AI is limiting.
You mean this one? This one, maybe?
Yeah.
This one? Yeah, there are two things. So explaining is not enough should mean you have to also empower or include people to participate in the making of AI. And explaining only is also limited because you have to find another way. So it's basically the explanation is a problem for empowerment, but only explaining, yeah. So it's a bit of a, yeah. I wanted to point out that transparency is not enough. And if it's only about the technical, it has to be more. But at the same time, you need to do more than explaining. Yeah.
Okay. I read the structure of the sentence wrong.
Yeah,
it makes sense. Okay. Thank you.
Right. Yes. The question at the back.
What do you base your account of explainability on? Is it anything specific, or rather just explainability in the terms of the recipient has to understand it afterwards?
Sorry. So who did you ask specifically? Is it like between us or?
Both. Who wants to answer?
All right. I'm not 100% sure where you're hinting at, but there have been debates about what it means to explain a system, what aspects should be explained, who should understand what, right? Is it the is there a meaning in explaining something per se? Is it really about conveying something specific, right, to the user maybe, or to the person that kind of gets the explanation? And to what extent should these explanations be? But I'm not sure this is addressing what you're asking.
It's more general on what your stance in this project on explanation is. Rather, what is, when has something been like explained enough to the point?
All right. Okay. Yeah. That's a very good point. So, all right. Now I get it. Yeah, that's a very tough thing, right? So when do you know enough? So what we did, at least in the interview studies, we always set a task, right? And we were kind of wondering how much information, or kind of giving them information until they felt confident to make a decision. That has to be done with care, and that's also risky, right? Because you know, right, like if you know very little, you feel like you know everything, right? And all these kinds of things, right? But we were more trying to orient this towards them, enabling them to solve a certain task, right? Decide that they want this system, decide they trust these systems. But obviously, you have to take care to also like show people in such a context their blind spots. All the ethical aspects behind designing explanations, and whether this is like, who does it, right? Like if you design an explanation, if you would do a new explanation, something of you and how you think should be done should go in there, and this would shape what you explain, could introduce yet another biases and so on. So this is a very non-trivial task, and probably there's not even a single way to get that right.
I will take, actually, Thorsten, don't be mad at me, the prerogative to ask final question, because I really want to know, because in our project on content moderation that I presented some weeks ago, we had quite similar discussions, and that when you ask citizens or individuals what they want from a system, one of the most prominent things is they want to know why is somebody doing it. So motivations, human intentions. So why are you deleting my comment? Why are you making the system be so like this and this? And this is a huge problem if you only focus on the system. So the human motivation, the human intention. This is also, how are you considering this in your projects? For any of you, I don't know.
I cannot really answer this like specifically only for a project, but I can say what the problem or danger is in these kind of discussions, because I do also analyze lots of company kind of communication. And if you ask companies, and this is just throughout the whole ethics debates, no one will ever say, I do this to steal your data, or I do this to manipulate your opinion. They will always say, we democratize. We want to make things amazing. So how much do you then, so you can explain certain things in a very romantic way always, and things are always errors, they're always bugs, they're never part of the algorithm. So traditionally we know that specifically with companies, not in science maybe, but with companies is always tricky. And now we have so many company products that the why is to be researched on, but not so much to be just explained, because you might not find a solution.
Thank you. All right. Thank you so much, Eugenia. Sebastian, again, thank you for your presentation. And with that, we go to the next presenter, Marta Sabu. I'm announcing you while I'm walking. Marta Sabu from the WU is also going to talk about AI transparency. And we're looking forward to getting your view, Marta.
Hello, hello. Good evening. Hi. This is my pointer. Everything works. Okay. So, dear students, dear colleagues, dear Michael, dear WWTF, thank you for joining this talk so late today. This is the last talk for the Ringvorlesung this year, so I really appreciate that you are in the room. So as Sophie said, I come from the Wirtschaftsuniversität, so just a short ride with you too. I was very happy to be invited in this Ringvorlesung, because we also just recently joined the digital humanism movement in earnest. Right, so it works, right? This one, it works. Okay, good. So actually I will continue with kind of a complementary talk to what Sebastian and Jenny said. So I'm also going to look at AI system transparency. I'm very sorry I don't have the answer for empowerment yet. But I'm going to look at another method. I'm going to look at AI system auditability, right? So previous speakers talked more about AI explainability, and these are similar methods, but not quite the same. So if you want to put this in the context of this Vorlesung, in my opinion, AI system transparency is something that relates to digital humanism, is a strong enabler of digital humanism. That's why I underline digital humanism on the highest title. The core part of the talk will be about a method from computer science. So we are computer scientists, you will see later on, that enables this system transparency. Before I go on, I want to mention that this is work that has been performed by my colleagues, in particular Laura Waltersdorfer. I brought her here to support me, also maybe in the Q&A session. She's doing this work as part of her PhD, and also other colleagues from WU and TU, and I have the pleasure to report on it tonight. Okay, so to put it black and white, just what I told you in the introductory slide, and to repeat it again, in summary, the message I want to bring in this talk is that AI system transparency, about which already heard so much mentioned in the previous talk, is an enabler of digital humanism and can be improved through AI system auditing, so through this computer science method. And to bring this message through, the talk is structured in 3 parts, right? So we'll start with the motivating part, more from a digital humanism perspective, where I will explore what is system transparency, why is it important, what are motivating use cases, how does it relate to digital humanism at all, at least from our perspective. Then in the second part, I will move on to explore this method of AI system auditing. And I will do this by showing you 2 examples of how 2 AI systems were audited. Yeah? So I'll try to keep the technical details to a minimum. And last but not least, in the last part, I want to look a little bit forward on the impact that these methods could have now with the advent of the EU AI Act by ensuring compliance to this act. So looking a little bit at the impact that these methods could have later on. Good, so to start with the first part, as I mentioned, this is more from the digital humanism perspective and the motivation. Why is AI system transparency important? Let's look at a few motivating examples. Actually, this is now very easy because the colleagues before already gave you a lot of examples, but I want to bring my own related to untrustworthy AI systems, right? So they mentioned already a lot of examples where AI systems discriminated, and this is usually the examples that we bring in most of the talks. So I also have one of such example already from 2018. So I think that is more or less around the same time as the Dutch scandal, right? And this refers to word embeddings methods. Who knows what word embeddings are? Okay, the usual suspect. So word embedding methods are methods from natural language processing that can process large amounts of data and find kind of latent semantics between words, right? So you feed them a large amount of corpus and they can discover which words relate to each other. And then the problem is the relations that they discover. So these latent relations, for example, in this article, they've shown that these word embeddings quantify gender and ethnic stereotypes that were present in the corpus. In particular, they found that certain ethnic groups were associated often to, for example, blue-collar jobs, the Hispanic ethnicity, while Asian and white ethnicity were associated more to white-collar jobs, such as being professors and physicists, scientists, and so on and so forth. Right, so this is actually brings back this IMS scandal a little bit also in the room. And you might wonder, why should I care, right? It is, I mean, these embeddings just show the discrimination and the bias that exist in the data. So they just have a mirror to us as a society about the stereotypes that we have. So to make this a little bit more palpable, I wanted in the next example to bring to the stage a person that was affected by such a discrimination system, an AI system that discriminated. So meet Joy Bulamvini. Who knows Joy? Already, okay, one person, very good. Okay, so Joy Bulamvini in around 2016-17 was a student at MIT, just as many of you, right, going about her business, studying, but she had a problem. Yes, every time she tried to access the campus of the university and she had to go through a system that recognized faces, she couldn't get through. The systems most of the time didn't recognize her. And she was wondering why does it happen, especially because her white male colleagues just went through without any problem. And one day, in desperation, she took a white mask and put it on her face, and suddenly the system worked, and she could access the facilities of the campus because the system recognized this is a human face, right? How would you feel? Right? This is really bad, right? This is the situations that digital humanism wants to avoid. Yeah, we want everybody to be treated fairly and not go through such situations. So you can understand the rage that she went through, and this went so far that it empowered her maybe to look closer at the systems and try to have some transparency of what's going on. Why is this the case? So she had chose a master topic related to this particular investigation, and wrote a paper that for now has been cited 7,000 times. So maybe a good paper to read during your Christmas holidays, because it's becoming a computer science classic. And what she showed in this paper, I'm just going to have here the main results. She took 3 gender classifiers from 3 very well-known companies, so Microsoft, Facebook, and IBM, and then checked their accuracy, so how well they classified images of persons, but not looking at a set of images alone, but looking at subsets of images representing different subgroups of phenotypic and gender intersectional groups. Yeah? So Michael is already shaking his head, right? So exactly what she found out, that, for example, for images of lighter males, systems worked up to 100% accuracy. That's why the male colleagues went through. But in particular, images of darker females were very hard for the system to process, and the accuracy of these systems was much lower for this so-called intersectional group that she studied, right? So this was one step towards transparency in understanding how the system performs for a particular group. And this relates very much to the topic that we discussed today, right? Because she wanted to have some transparency, right, to understand the performance of the system. And what she has done one of the first audits of such systems, right? That she really had a question and wanted to answer it. And of course, now this is a very concrete example, and maybe you can feel it on your own skin, how she felt. But imagine if such systems were part of other workflows, for example, in the police, right, when they do automatic identification of potential criminals, or in a healthcare system where certain machine learning or AI algorithms don't work so well on samples of darker skin, and so on and so forth. So these are the kind of situations we want to avoid. And now let me take it to a more abstract level, right? So we want to go from this untrustworthy AI to more trustworthy AI. Luckily, the European Commission is already investing a lot in understanding what this means. So I brought here a few slides from the high-level expert group of AI of European Commission, just to understand, right, where we want to go. And they define trustworthy AI as AI systems that are lawful, ethical, and robust, as well as those that align to 4 ethical principles, right? So they should have respect for human autonomy, they should prevent harm, they should be fair, and should have explicability, right? So you can already see that the system that didn't classify Joy's face was not really a fair system, right? And it needed extra effort for her to make it explainable and transparent. Let's deal a little bit with these ethical principles, because HLEC took this one level higher and also identified some key requirements for trustworthy AI. So you see here the 7 requirements for trustworthy AI. I'm not going to go in all of them, but just highlight that they relate very logically to the ethical principles. For example, human agency and oversight is directly related to respect for human autonomy, diversity, non-discrimination, and fairness to the fairness principle, and so on and so forth. And what is particularly interesting for this talk are the transparency and accountability requirements. So I'm going to look a little bit in more detail. So what do they mean through this? Transparency means that AI systems and their decisions should be explained in a manner adapted to the stakeholders concerned, right? And I think this was a point made very clearly also in the previous presentation. But also, accountability comes a little bit closer, right? So we want systems to be transparent, but also accountable, which means that we need mechanisms to ensure responsibility and accountability for AI systems and their outcomes. And one example of such a method is auditability, right? So auditability enables the assessment of algorithms, data, and design processes of the system, right? So it goes a bit further than just explaining the decision of the system, but refers more to a broader scope of the system and maybe the entire life cycle of the system. In particular, in applications affecting fundamental rights, AI systems should be able to be independently audited, right? So all these are things that HLEG is telling us, and here I wanted to make the point of how transparency that we've seen is so important, right, for avoiding such cases as the case of Joy relates to auditability. And this is what we are going to look at, but not before a last slide where I want to mention that auditability and audits are not the only mechanism to ensure transparency. And for this, I brought here one snippet from an article by Professor Prehm from your university, University of Vienna, where he looked at several several methods to ensure ethical issues in AI systems. Audits are one of them, but there's other things like algorithms, metrics, process models, and software libraries. Okay, so there's a lot of methods out there, and I'm going to focus now on audits. Just turn my page to see my notes. Okay, very good. All right. So we are now moving from the digital humanism perspective more to the methods perspective, right? What I promised at the beginning, and want to look at AI system auditing. I want to say that this is a very active research area, so there's a lot of definitions of AI system audits, but we keep with the definition from our group, which Laura came up with after several years and reading several hundred papers. So just for keeping this in the time scope of the talk. We defined auditability as the ability of an auditor to obtain accurate and relevant auditable artifacts for answering concrete audit questions when examining an AI system. So this is a hard definition to comprehend at this hour. Therefore, I'm going to break it up for you in the main stakeholders, right? So we have auditors on one hand, people that are interested about some aspect of the system. Then we have an AI system that we want to put under our magnifying glass and understand what's going on. And these auditors have audit questions, right? They have some question about this system. And auditability comes in by taking these questions of the auditors, collecting the relevant information from the systems, and bringing this together to generate some answers back to the auditors, some questions, right? So this is the simple scheme that you have to understand about audits, and I will use it over and over again, so by the end of the lecture, you will be able to draw it on a beer pad in the pub after the lecture. Okay, so Having said that, now I will revisit the example of Joy, but more from this technical perspective, okay? So let's see, I told you she was one of the first people who did the system audit. Let's see whether indeed that was the case, right? So we are looking now at auditing gender classifiers and what was the setup of the audit. This is the same picture as in the other slide. The AI systems audited were these free gender classifiers, right, that were used by the university campus. The auditors were Joy and one of her colleagues who were not involved in the creation of the system. We call them external auditors, right? The audit questions were also quite clear, right? They wanted to find out whether there's a bias with respect to phenotypic or gender subgroups, and in particular, whether images of females and dark-skinned individuals are affected. Yet the performance of the system is affected by these images. The auditable artifacts were system execution results, and I'm explaining this in the next slide, where I tell you more about their approach to perform this auditability. Yeah? So this is not very easy to explain here. So what have they done to to answer their auditability question? They had a two-steps approach. So first, they started by building a data set. It turns out that most image data sets for training face recognition systems are heavily biased towards images of white-skinned individuals and males. Sorry, guys, this is the case. So what the first step they did was to really create a data set that was balanced with respect to these characteristics, so that they had a more or less proportional representation of male, female, white-skinned, dark-skinned people. And by the way, these are politicians from different countries, because these pictures you can get freely online. And then they could go around the globe and fish all the skin tones that they needed for their experiments. In the second phase, they took this data set and then they ran the free classifiers on them and computed a few metrics. So what I'm going to show you, this very scary table, this is the academic version of the nice, colorful table from the first slide, but I'll explain it. So you see the free classifiers, and then let's focus on the error rate. So the error rate says how many percentage of 100 images are not classified correctly. You can see here these range from 6% to 12%, which is not a very good system, but it's not that bad either, right? So when, let's say, 6 people out of 100 are not let through such a system. Now they went a bit further. Mostly image classifiers report these overall performance metrics, but then when you compare, for example, images of females and males and how the system performs on them, you can see for all three systems that images of females had a higher error rate, so the system had more problems to classify them. They did the same exercise for darker skin and lighter skin, and not surprisingly, here again, images of darker-skinned individuals had a higher error rate than the lighter skin. Then they created these intersectional groups. So DF stands for dark female, DM for dark male, and so on and so forth. And here you can see that these errors propagate really a lot. And in these very niche groups, already the dark-skinned females had a very high error rate, right? So this is how they managed to get some transparency in the system performance for their particular audit question. Okay. So we have seen now a first example of system auditing. I hope this is not very difficult. I'm trying to keep it high level. It's much more details. I want now to stop for a reflection slide, right? So if you think about how Joy went about auditing her system, she has taken an approach that unfortunately it's still very much the status quo in auditing AI systems. In particular, she had a quite narrow focus, right? She just was interested in the performance of the system. She performed it once, mostly manually, right? So she just sent the data, got the results, and that was it. So there was no continuous support. And the idea was to detect some misfunction in the system. Now, Of course, this was 2018, so a lot changed. We have the EU AI Act. If you want to audit your systems in terms of all the requirements of EU AI Act, this will not take you further, right? You need something more robust. So the entire field is going towards so-called continuous automated AI system auditing, where the idea is to have a broad focus, right? So to be able to ask questions, maybe even about how the system was built, how it was trained, and so on. And this should be automated and continuous to monitor the system and to play more a preventive role rather than a detective role. Wonderful. And in the next few slides, I want to give you an example of a use case that we have worked on. Maybe this is not so easy to relate to as Joy's example, but nevertheless quite interesting in my opinion, based on a project, an FFG project that we performed together with a legal permit agency in Austria, right? And what the use case was, extracting key elements for legal permits. So let me explain you what this means. So this agency had a lot of such legal permits. Here see a legal permit requested by Johann Wurst, a fictional character from the city of Salzburg, who wanted to create an installation of a new electroplating barrel machine, right? And every time you want to do these fancy things, you need a permit. I mean, we're in Austria, right? So, and this agency has a lot of these permits. They are PDFs. It's very hard to manage them. So what they wanted was an AI system that could extract so-called key elements, such as the reference number and issuing date, the operator that requested such a permission, and the issuing authority, as well as a number of legal characteristics, right? Whether the permission was given and under which conditions. And this would have helped them a lot to manage their documents, especially if this data would be highlighted in the document itself. So our role was to build this AI system that took permits as an input and then identified this data. And the extra requirement was that this AI system should be auditable. Okay, so let's see now how we went about auditing the system. And you can see here how much more important this use case is. I mean, we are working on legal permits with legal authorities. Here we need this continuous and automated auditing. We can't just do manual auditing now and then when we kind of have some time for it. And to give you more insight into how complex this problem was, I brought you an example of a simple sentence from an Austrian legal permit. By the way, this is not generated. One colleague asked me, is this generated by AI? No, this is written by a human, by a lawyer. Maybe there's lawyers between you. I mean, they are superhuman. Well, those of you that are not dozing off yet might notice that there's a column at the end of the sentence. So actually, this is just half a sentence from this legal permit, right? So for this, you need a very complex AI system to get this information out from there. Good, let's see how we audited this. I'm going to focus now on the audit setup first, right? So the same pictures that you've seen before. The AI system that we wanted to audit is the system that extracts the key elements. And in the next slide, I show you a little bit, some details about how it worked, right? So this is the simple representation, but internally there's several stages, right? You start, for example, with the text itself, then one component identifies parts of the text that seem like good options for these key entities. Then there's the main AI pipeline that can tell you that City of Salzburg is an issuing authority. And then last but not least, we take this extracted data and we align it with an ontology, which is nothing more than kind of a vocabulary in the domain, right? So instead of just saying City of Salzburg, we can say this is the magistrate of the City of Salzburg. So we link it to an entity. The system is much more complex internally, right? But just wanted to give you an idea that this is much more than these classifiers that Joy has audited, right? So it's a really complex pipeline of various elements. Okay, so that's the AI system. The AI auditors are also very interesting, right? So we had two types. We had the AI system owners, so the people who installed this software, and then the legal permit owners. These were the people who provided their legal permits. And they had quite different questions, right? So the system owner wanted to know things about how confident is the system in the extraction of certain entities, but also details of the machine learning modules, how often certain errors occur over time. I think I saw some of these questions also on your slides. And the legal permit owner wanted to know whether the system sometimes didn't perform through, whether there was some problem with processing some of the permits. So this was the setup. Now going to the approach, as I already mentioned, we couldn't do this just manually as Joy did, but what we needed was an automated AI system as an auditing approach that would connect these two worlds, right? Get the audit questions, get the auditable artifacts, provide an audit report, and we actually needed to build a whole system by itself, so an AI audit infrastructure, right, to make this thing, this audit continuous and automated. Good. So let me just show you how an audit report looks like. Probably now you are wondering what this AI audit infrastructure provides in the end. Here's some examples. So these are the first four questions that I showed you 2 slides before about the audit questions. The audit report would mention these questions and some answers to them, but also contain concrete data that would support these answers. For example, related to the confidence value for certain operators, you would have this continuously collected data, or related to the error types, you would have a table with the error types. All right. Okay, so that's how auditing worked in this complex scenario, and our work in computer science is to provide frameworks and tools to create this AI audit infrastructure. And at this point, I had 200 slides about our work, which I, with bleeding heart, I had to squeeze into 1 slide, right? So I'm just going to flash very quickly some of the methods in computer science. So we have a framework for auditing AI systems. We also came up with processes that guide you through setting up such an audit system, and various software artifacts such as data models, reference architectures that people can reuse as blueprints for building these auditing infrastructures. Okay, great. So end of part 2. You're all still with me? Yes, okay, thank you. Enough with the technical details, so I hope now you have a bit of understanding what I mean with AI system auditing and how it can differ from a simplish case of Joy to a more complex industrial case. Let's look a little bit ahead of what it could mean for the EU AI Act. Very recently, we stumbled on the work of Brajovic and al., who took the EU AI Act and extracted so-called transparency requirements. For example, they found a lot of transparency requirements about the use case that the AI system addressed. You can see here some examples. The EU AI Act asks you to report a short solution summary, to document the intended purpose of an AI, and so on and so forth. So they have now this catalog of articles in the Act and what it means in terms of a requirement to report some data about them. They did so for data, for model-related questions, for deployment-related questions, and so on. In total, they identified about 60 different transparency requirements that you should comply to if you want to comply to the EU AI Act. And then Laura said, there's an opportunity here. Why don't we use our auditing system to check these requirements? Brilliant, right? So you can change all these transparency requirements into audit questions, right? And just check whether the system complies with them. And that's what we've done, actually, what Laura has done, right? She took painstakingly all these 60 requirements and checked whether they could already be answer to with an auditing system. We found some of them, yes, you see this last column. Some still needed a lot of knowledge and rules, right? So, for example, cybersecurity, explainability are very broadly defined. It's very hard to quantify them and to check them automatically. A lot of these transparency requirements still require human oversight, right? So when they ask you to evaluate the danger to life and death, that's very hard to do automatically, right? So here we will always need a human involved, but an auditing system could help collect the data for these judgments. And in total, we, for now, can cover about 20% of these requirements with the auditing approaches. We looked at ours, but maybe others can do a little bit more. So this is good news. We can make a real impact, hopefully, especially since the Act goes live next year, right? So next year, companies have to be compliant with it. I'm closing now, right? So yeah, the talk summary, as I said, AI system transparency is an enabler for digital humanism, and we saw how AI system auditing can help it, and we saw the 3 parts of the talk. You already know them. I just want to close with future work, actually just mirroring what Eugenia said, that we need a multidisciplinary approach to system transparency. We work mostly for a computer science perspective, and we would like to explore what social sciences have to say, for example, to improve our methods, to quantify these fluffy concepts like trust, fairness. Also, a lawyer's perspective would be very important. And the last future work is for you. I mean, I know it's not a story of joy, but remember the story of joy in everyday life. If you see some systems that misbehave, you have the power to do something about it. She showed it. And if you really want to take it to the next level, consider joining our doctoral college on digital humanism. The call just opened. We already have applicants. You have time till the 15th of January to apply. There are 5 PhD positions currently open on all fascinating topics. This is the QR code. If you're interested, you will be bombarded in all possible mailing lists with that. And if you're interested, we'll be happy to answer questions. Thank you so much. Sorry for maybe going a bit over time.
Excellent closing.
Yes, I thought you'd like it.
Right, so we're almost out of time, unfortunately. Officially, we have 1 more minute. But are any pressing questions for Marta? Otherwise, you can also approach her now as we're closing. And if you're interested in the PhD position, please let us know. Yeah, we're recruiting at WTU and Univi for these type of positions.
WU has a wonderful campus, by the way. I hope that message came through.
Univi has a wonderful campus in the city center. No, you're right. The WU is better.
We are much funkier. Right. I'm sorry.
It's pretty, for sure. One question from Sebastian before we close.
Thank you, Sebastian.
Yeah. Thank you. So I like the approach where you took the EU Act in the very end to come up with things to check, because I put on my list a question on how to come up with the artifacts you want to check in the first place. For instance, when it's now about checking whether the system can explain whatever it is doing, whether it's transparent. It sounds like something which is very hard to translate into things you can easily and automatically check. Do you have any thoughts or experience on that?
On how to translate things, sorry.
So like if a system should be fair, for instance, let's say this, right? Like how do you translate this? I mean, there are already 50 definitions of fairness, right? Yes. So can people specify what they want, and can you then check this?
No, this is the problem. I mean, this is why we hope that social scientists and humanities can help us, but I understood that they have also a lot of definitions of their own. But maybe, like, I think fairness means something different in each use case, right? So this can be seen more like an audit objective, and in the case of Joy, this fairness was how do you treat images of people that are, have certain characteristics. But generally, if you just take the overall concept, it's very hard. And this is the main problem also with the EU AI Act, that is super undefined, of course, because it has to be covering many use cases. And this is going to be a challenge, right? And it would be good exactly to provide companies these kinds of understanding, how do I break down fairness to concrete questions, to concrete transparency requirements that I can check. If I knew, I'd make a company now.
We work together, find a solution.
Yes, we work together. Yes.
Thank you so much, Marta. Thank you so much, Ginia and Sebastian. And wish you all a good break. And I'll see you back in January for a lecture. Thank you so much.
Thank you.